The US Open's getting ready to start. It's great to welcome back our friend Chris Clarey to the show. Chris, how you doing as we get ready for another fortnight in New York?
I'm still getting over that Alcaraz Djokovic match in Cincinnati. That was something special.
Okay, so let's start there before we get to the US Open, because obviously everybody hopes that you get to that in the finals, but it seems like that is sort of the next matchup that rivalry is sort of symbolizing a transition in tennis. You know, Federer's gone. We'll talk about Nadal in a little bit, but you've got some of these new rivalries. Talk about that rivalry and what it means right now for tennis.
I mean, it's manna from heaven, really, for tennis. I mean, you would figure after the big three era, the golden era, rightly called, that ended with Federer retiring and Nadal, on the brink of retirement, coming back maybe next year if he can get his body back together again for one more run. But there's no guarantee. So basically, it's Djokovic on his own now, and this young guy from Spain emerges who's just brilliant. Not only is he a great tennis player, he's great to watch, and he's a guy I've spent some time with as a journalist, and he's got a good heart. He's not perfect by any means, but he's a charming guy. He's got a positive energy about him, and it's just incredible to see this emerge right now the way that it's emergent. Ultimately, the matches that we're seeing between Djokovic and Alcaraz now, they've played three in a row on three different surfaces in the last 3 months. The first one at the French Open didn't finish because of the way it should have, because of the cramps from Alcaraz, but it was still great tennis for a couple sets. Wimbledon final, no arguments there. Fantastic stuff. And then the one in Cincinnati was best of three, but felt like it was best of five or best of seven, the way they were playing. They just match up so well. Intensity's there. The talent levels are similar. And it's that autumn, spring matchup of the 36-year-old against a 20-year-old. And it's pretty rare that happens. To see guys be able to hang at those different ends of the generations like that. But it's special when it occurs. And we're in it. And I agree. I think everybody's kind of counting the days till Djokovic Alcaraz 5, which would be in the US Open final.
Well, that's it. Chris, you've been writing about Alcaraz and Djokovic. How important is not just the talent of tennis players, but having charisma? It seems that more than any sport that I can think of, that the players who have charisma on one side or the other, that are either liked because the way that they act, or are the villains, the way that they act, that seems to drive a lot of fans in tennis.
No, there's no doubt, because it's a one-on-one game, and there's a lot of face time in tennis, a lot of, you can call it dead time, if you will, between the actual action, 25 seconds between the time the ball's put in play. You're seeing the guys' faces all the time. And so I'd be curious what you mean by charisma, though. Do you mean the charisma of the playing of the game, or do you mean the charisma of what you know about the person off the court?
No, I mean the person themselves. It seems to be almost like a, maybe not in the United States, because we haven't had, other than the Williams sisters recently, somebody of that magnitude. But it seems worldwide that these are like superstars. Like, we're just not used to this anymore. When you and I and Jason grew up, there were these superstars that had these big personalities. Now we don't have these big personalities that are matched with the skill level.
Well, it's interesting, because I don't think Alcaraz has a big personality yet. But I mean, anybody who follows him and watches him play tennis, he has charisma because of the way he plays. I mean, you just can't take your eyes off of him. So there's a bit of Federer there in that sense. I mean, Federer was in a different vibe because he had the elegance and the balletic approach to it, and this way of surprising you with his shot making, and you wanted to watch it. But Alcaraz is expressive emotionally in a way that Federer was not, at least in his prime, and he's an incredible mover, explosive mover, and he's an acrobat. So all those things come together. I wouldn't say he's a charismatic guy off the court, but I think he's already a tennis superstar because of the way he plays the game and the positive energy and the energy that he communicates with the crowd. I mean, I went to Indian Wells this year in March. Djokovic was still not able to get in the country because of the vaccination issue with the coronavirus. Nadal was out. Federer is retired. And basically Alcaraz, before he'd even play these great matches against Djokovic, was carrying the tournament. Big stadium, 15,000 seats, in the desert of California. And it was full whenever he played. He won the US Open last year, set the table, but just because of how he plays. There have been plenty of guys who've won slams that are, very fine players, but just don't have that sort of must-watch kind of vibe to him. And I really think he has it. But we'll see how he grows into the role off the court, because if he can add in, provocative personality, putting himself in a position where he, gives great interviews on camera, he's still kind of struggling with his English a bit, then it'll go to another notch. But even without that already, I think he's must-see TV.
It kind of gets to something that Jeff and I have been talking about. Jeff's been watching it. I haven't been able to watch it. I watched the Full Swing show, which was about the golf tour. Jeff's been watching Break Point. These shows, these sort of docu-series where you get to see the athlete in a way that you don't on the court. You see who they are for good and for bad through the eyes of these shows that are on Netflix and other channels. Can you talk about the rise of shows like Breakpoint and the role they're playing in growing a fan base that may be interested in tennis, but may be interested in the storyline around tennis just as much?
Yeah, I mean, my question is, how much is saturation for this approach? I agree, it's great. And to full disclosure, I haven't seen the second batch. I've just seen the first batch of Breakpoint, the one that focused a lot on Kyrgios and Berrettini and Felix Auger-Aliassime and those players. And I personally think it's great because honestly, the barriers for us on the print journalist side in particular have really gone up over the years. It's gotten harder and harder to get inside these athletes' lives and to connect with them. Their time is limited. They have it broken up in very new ways now with all their own social media, with the tours media. There's just a lot of people pulling at them, whereas before you'd get a good chunk for the independent legacy media. And that's harder and harder to get. I mean, New York Times, for whom I worked for so many years, was still getting it, but not many were. And so I think this is a great opportunity for the fans to get a look. It is curated. I mean, obviously there's the tours are giving the access and the players are too. So don't think it's journalism, but it's entertainment in a way that I think expands people's understanding of the challenges of the sport, the mentality that's behind it, kind of the agony that a sport like tennis does engender with its, basically how good are you? It's only as good as your last tournament or your last match. But I sort of question, it seemed great with Formula One because we really had not seen that approach very often before. It seemed great with the Jordan doc, Last Dance. I just don't know if everybody's going to start doing it. I mean, I know track and field is now going to start doing it internationally, and they're another sport that is really needs a boost because they're losing ratings globally. Used to be, the Olympic sport of all Olympic sports, but if everybody does it at some point, then it's going to, I think, affect how much impact it truly has. But I think it's great, and I think anything behind the scenes. Just don't think it's journalism because it's not.
In looking at Breakpoint, watching it, regardless of the curation of it, which I think we could all agree on, the one thing that I came away from was the mental side of tennis and how difficult tennis is as a sport because it's an individualized sport. As somebody who's covered the sport and written biographies of some of the biggest players in the game, how important is the mental side of the sport?
Well, I think really it is in a game where the margins on the court between the shot making are so slim, and in a game where there's so much time to think between points, even between shots at times, I think the mental game is really what distinguishes the champion from the great champion, the almost champion from the champion, the journeyman from the solid pro. It's just those tennis matches when you watch a lot of them, very often they come down to a few critical points, be it a break point, be it a point when the momentum in the match is shifting and a point shifts it back. There probably are top players will tell you probably 8 or 10 points in a match that make the difference. To be able to maximize your abilities in those situations and to produce something close to your best game is what makes you a champion. And those are critical things. And that's so players put an enormous amount of focus on it. It was kind of in the shadows in tennis for a long time. It wasn't talked about as much. There's a lot of talk about choking, but there wasn't so much talk about how you created mental strength, even though there was a lot of fascination about it. But it's come all the way out now into the Open. There's much more discussion about it. You're seeing Iga Swiatek, the number one women's player in the world who won the US Open last year, travels with a performance psychologist full time. You're seeing more and more players being very upfront about that. And that's good. I think that's very healthy. And ultimately, tennis is an excruciatingly difficult sport mentally because you have so much downtime to manage. And ultimately, I think the matches are decided in that downtime. Look at Rafa Nadal. I'm writing a book about him now, spending a lot of time focusing on his mental game. But a lot of his rituals, call them tics, if you will, that is a way to manage that dead time. It's his ability to sort of put himself in an in-the-moment situation with all the things he's doing with his body and picking at his nose and everything else, trying to find a way to center himself before he has to perform. So I think we ultimately can't even underestimate the importance of the mental side in tennis in particular.
Is it something, at least from what you've seen, that you can develop over time? It seems like the greats aren't players that develop the mental side. It seems like they were either born with it or grew up with it or just seem to have it from the outset. It doesn't seem like Like you can get there, you can get somewhere, but you can't really get there. Like you're either born like this or you're not. As far as these, is that something you've noticed, or am I getting that wrong?
It's there. I think people who are good at it from an early age, who are able to put themselves in the moment, block out the static, and sort of allow themselves to let it flow. Yeah, they probably keep that skill. But I have seen players get much better at it. If you want to go way back, think about Ivan Lendl, who was considered, frankly, a big match choker early in his career. Wasn't able to produce his best. He's a very sharp mind, smart guy, good chess player, but I think he overthought things a lot. But his approach was to be very systematic about it. He was one of the first prominent tennis players to get a mental coach and to work with a sports psychologist. And he did a lot of work on centering himself. I wrote about this in the Master, a book on Federer, about how Lendl basically would take an apple and he'd describe the apple to himself out loud. He'd go, Ivan Lendl is holding an apple and Ivan Lendl is putting the apple in the basket. And Ivan Lendl's now going to turn around and go out of the room. I'll stop there instead of taking you into more boredom there. But his idea was he talked himself out loud.
Made me hungry.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever he could have. Or Ivan Lendl is driving to get rid of the food and he's turning the wheel. But it sounds silly, but what he was doing was finding a way to center himself with his voice. And then obviously during the match, the voice shut off, hopefully. And he became an internal dialogue that it became exactly what you were doing in the moment. And Lendl ultimately was able to conquer a lot of his big match nerves and become a repeated champion, one of the best players of the Open era. Navratilova as well, at the same period, had difficulty with her nerves early in her career, was able to overcome that. I would look at, in, I guess, recent times, Simona Halep, who's not in the best situation right now with this potential doping suspension and all that, but she was a player who had a real trouble with getting across the hurdle in the big matches, was able to make some progress there. So I think, and Federer too, frankly, from having written about him up close and very in detail, he was somebody who struggled with his temper, with controlling himself, and he became a Zen master in a lot of ways. Still lost a fair number of matches when he had match point. Wasn't always the best closer, but you can't argue with his overall results. So I do see some progress, but I think if you kind of have that from an early age, you kind of keep it.
So I'll get to the tournament in a minute. We've kind of hinted around it with different things, talking about your Substack. You've mentioned you're writing a book on Rafa Nadal. After 32 years, 6 continents, 6,000 stories later, you're moving on of your own full decision in good parting with the New York Times, but you're going to become an author and be writing. You're writing about Nadal. We won't get into the details of the book, but talk to us about this different part of your own journey that's going on right now.
Oh, you're nice to ask. It's been an emotional time. It's a long time to be working someplace. I worked at the International Herald Tribune, which was the New York Times global paper, for a long time, and the New York Times always for 3 decades, and very blessed to have done so. But I really felt when I did the Federer book a couple of years ago and really plunged into that it was a really rich experience. And I got lucky, became a bestseller in a lot of countries and gave me an opportunity to kind of make a choice. And I asked for a leave of absence from the Times. They had given me one for the Federer book. I wasn't expecting them to give me another one. I wasn't surprised they didn't give me one. So I had to make a choice between staying with the paper or going off in this new direction. I just felt at this stage in my career, after all these years, the adrenaline was really pumping writing the book. And I also, the Substack platform, I think, has really grown. And it's a chance for me to do some kind of daily journalism type writing there as well. So I think that's a nice combination, working on the deep, long form projects and having an immediate outlet. I'm doing something called Tennis and Beyond, which is I'm posting, at least once a week or sometimes more often during the slams, covering a lot of tennis on there. So it's a nice mix. But it's certainly bittersweet, and I don't want to get into all of this, but the crazy thing is that I quit, left on good terms, and then a month later, the New York Times announces that it's shutting down its entire sports department and outsourcing everything.
You did.
So people go, well, Chris, you must have known something. You must have had the inside scoop. Way to go. I didn't know a thing. I knew it was going to be complicated, but I didn't know that. So I'm a little bit heartbroken by the way that all played out, and a place that I contributed to for so long, and so many great voices have been writing for the New York Times sports department over the years. It's sad to see that go. And my colleagues are not losing their jobs. They're being distributed to different places and taking down different posts, but it won't be the same. And I think it's a loss. I'm sad about that.
It is somebody who writes about the sport. We talk about sports each week, and it changes from week to week. We just have to kind of go with it. And when you're writing about sports, especially as a columnist, you kind of go with what's week to week. How gratifying or how great is it for you to, again, be able to tackle a subject in such depth without going into the depth that you're doing with Nadal? We had a chance to talk to you when you were doing the Federer book, and it just seemed interesting and satisfying in a different kind of way to you that you're able to get to know all of these people that are in their lives and kind of learn about how this young man became this great champion.
Yeah, I think you need to have some questions and themes that you're really interested in digging into. And in the case of Nadal, even though I've covered him for so long, there definitely are those sorts of things. And his mental game is just so strong. We've been talking about that today. And I think that's ultimately his hallmark, is his ability to produce his best again and again under pressure. And he came out of no obvious adversity. So that's another interesting question. So how do you create that from a comfortable background, and how do you become one of the all-time mental giants, really, in any sport? And that whole process is really interesting to get into. And the good news is that you have all this time and ability to dig into all these things in detail. And the bad news is that you have all this time and ability to dig into these things in detail, because the bloody deadline's coming, and as a daily journalist, you're wired to produce on adrenaline. So it is definitely a challenge mentally to be able to crank out X number of words each day and do it. But it's a rich experience, and I feel like it's a challenge at this stage, and one that I'm really growing from, and I really appreciate the chance to have be able to do that.
So getting to the tournament that's about to start next week, no Federer, no Serena. Again, sort of a passing of the torch, but the defending champions, the 1 seeds going into the tournament. On the men's side, we started sort of where everybody would hope it ends, with another matchup of Alcaraz and getting what you want with Djokovic there. Talk about some of the other players to look out for, including for us, any Americans that people aren't really knowing going into the tournament, but should keep an eye on.
Well, if we're talking about the men, right? Is that you want
yeah,
to
we'll get to the women next.
The men, I think it's really a pretty good time in men's tennis in the U.S. comparatively to what we've seen maybe in the last 20 years or so. We still haven't had a men's Grand Slam champion since Andy Roddick, 2003 US Open, which is unprecedented for a sport we once dominated. So it's not like it used to be. But I think enough time has gone by now, with 20 years or so, that people are almost able to appreciate now what we have. And that is, we've got a bunch of players who are top 20 players. We have Frances Tiafoe, who reached the semifinals at the US Open last year. We have Taylor Fritz. Both of them are now in the top 10. We have Tommy Paul, who beat Carlos Alcaraz a couple times this year and is a really great all-court player. He's in the top 15. And you got some guys that are coming up on the outside, like Sebastian Korda, who's been hurt a bit this year, but has got a great deal of talent. He's the brother of Jessica and Nelly, the great golfers from the Korda family, whose both parents were top-level tennis players. Probably one of the great sports families in the world right now. So there are guys that are in the mix. They're going to create issues for people, and we have some other young talents as well. There's Ben Shelton, who's coming up, who got to the quarterfinals at the Australian Open this year. Just recently turned pro. His father, Brian Shelton, was a pro. Explosive left-handed serve. He's kind of struggled since Australia to win many matches, but he's got a lot of charisma and a lot of upside to his game. So I think there's some nice green shoots in men's tennis right now. But the problem is, I think we've seen that Alcaraz and Yannick Sinner, who's an Italian player who played that great match against Alcaraz at the US Open last year, ended up late night. Those two have played some classic matches, including in Miami this year as well. I think those guys have kind of defined themselves as the best young players in the world, obviously. So our American guys are just not quite in that category, but they definitely are spoilers and definitely are players who could go deep. Tommy Paul went to the semifinals of the Australian Open this year. Taylor Fritz has gone deep at slams and won the Indian Wells tournament, beat Rafa Nadal, who was hurt at the time, kind of, but still won the tournament last year. So they've had some big wins now. So I think there's a lot of volume there, a lot of quality volume. But are they real, champions there? I think the jury's out, and I think it's unlikely. But I wouldn't be surprised to see one of those guys win a major at some point in the next 5 to 6 years.
Well, in going into last year's U.S. Open, Taylor Fritz was the one that people were keeping an eye on, and Taylor Fritz went out very early. Tiafoe ended up being the darling for the United States side. What is it about Taylor Fritz this year that we can expect different than last year?
No, I don't know. Taylor, I don't think objectively has had as good a season as he had last year. I mean, he had the Indian Wells title. He had a deep run at Wimbledon. He hasn't had those sorts of major performances this year, but he's a quality player, and he's earned that top 10 spot. He's yet to play, I think, consistently his best tennis at the majors. He's a fighter. He's a scrapper, even though he's a 6'5" big server. That's the kind of guy he was as a junior, a bit like Andy Roddick was when he was young. Andy Roddick was known for his serve on the Pro Tour and his power, but actually he started out as a little scrapper guy in the juniors who fought for every point and ran behind the baseline. And Taylor Fritz was similar, so there's a little bit of that still in him, the mongrel street fighter. But he hasn't been able to produce his very best, and because he doesn't have maybe the all-court game to the same level coming to net via the backhand side. I don't think it's as explosive as some of the other players at the very top of the game. He is vulnerable to guys playing well against him and not being able to have, basically the edge that he needs to create the difference. But he does have a huge serve, and he's improved his forehand, and he's very combative. So I could see Taylor certainly where the game is right now, making a run to the quarters. Tiafoe has been really up and down this year. When he's played well, he's played very well. He's been a little bit struggling lately. It's like he's maybe running out of energy and a little bit of fuel coming into this part of the season, but we'll see. Loves the crowd, and New York will be behind him 100%. And Tommy Paul probably has had the best year, maybe of all those guys. Tommy Paul, Tiafoe, and Fritz all grew up together with Riley Opelka, who's 6'11", who's had some good results, but is hurt right now. But Tiafoe, Paul, and Fritz all in a very meaningful way bounce off each other.
You mentioned
that they're all doing well doesn't mean that's not a coincidence.
You mentioned late night. You had written about some of the matches that go very late into the night, early into the morning, and the impact that it has on the players in their next match and their future matches. We've seen some complaints about that with the women's matches being put on very late. As we go into talking about the women's side of the tournament, before we get there, can you talk about just how the tournament is structured, that we end up with matches going into the early morning for some of these players?
Objectively, it's insane. I mean, it really is. I mean, you got tennis being played at 3 a.m. in the middle of a tournament. And who does that benefit? I really don't know. Actually, if you just put it objectively and look at the clock and see them playing, you go, how can this be happening? It doesn't happen that often, but it happens enough that it should be an issue. And I've written about it a lot over the years to no avail. But eventually there will be some avail, I hope, as we go forward. But the reason it happens is ultimately comes down to money, but there's also the sub context, which is gender equality. So basically, the Grand Slam tournaments, take the US Open, for example, they have a night session. They need the night session for extra revenue. You need a night session for the television networks that cover it. They want that prime time window. Same thing's happening in Australia now. It started to happen in France. It didn't used to happen as much at French Open and Wimbledon, but certainly Australia and the US. And because of the focus, rightly so, on gender equality, there's a desire to have both a men's match and a women's match at night. So if you start at 7 p.m., with the expandable accordion-like nature of tennis, you don't know when and really it's going to start, when it's going to finish. You can't control that. It can be best of 5. It can be 3 sets. It could be 5 sets. It could be 2 hours. It could be 5.5 hours. So that creates these situations where when you have tight matches, it can go deep into the night and the early morning. And I have covered tennis that's ended at 4 in the morning, 4:30 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 3:30 in the morning. Lately, it seems to be accelerating. I think the differences on tour are pretty slim right now. A lot of close matches, a lot of tight matches. There's now a shot clock, which you think would speed up things, but in fact, it's slowing them down because the players are using the clock and going, I have all this time before I'm able to serve. I'm going to use it all. Take my time. So I think there's some real issues the sport needs to iron out. Do they try to alternate men's matches one night, women's matches the next, slide into doubles as well to have a little bit more flexibility? I don't know, but I just don't think it's fair to the players or to the fans or those people who work at a tournament to have these 2:30, 3 a.m. finishes. It means players aren't going to bed until sunrise. It means they got to play their next match, even if they might have, ostensibly a day off. Part of that day off is spent recovering and sleeping in, and then they have to come back and play the next day. At a regular WTA event, there aren't these days off built in. It's a 1-week event usually, and we saw that this year in Canada. Elena Rybakina, former Wimbledon champion, played till 3 a.m, kind of ruined her whole tournament. It just throws everything off. So the reason it exists is the desire to have these night sessions, separate sessions, and a sport needs to have a long look at it. If there were really a strong union in tennis, like there is in other sports, I think this would have been solved long ago. There hasn't been one. And I think it just needs to be addressed and needs to end.
Speaking of the women's game, what are you expecting out of the U.S. women going into the U.S. Open this year?
That's exciting in a way because a lot of question marks, but also a lot of upside. I mean, Coco Gauff, people have felt like she's been spinning her wheels a little bit the last couple of years. Obviously a great prodigy, Wimbledon 4th round in her very first Wimbledon at age 15, got to the French Open final last year, still in her teens. You can't complain. I mean, obviously this is a remarkable athlete and a very poised young woman, but really wasn't having great results this year in particular. And people were kind of felt, well, her game's not really maturing and growing. I think there was a recognition after she lost the first round at Wimbledon that she needed to get her game into a different place. So she made some tough choices. I think she kind of put her family a little bit to the side in terms of how they impacted her tennis. Her father was, I know, eager to make that move for a while, but has made it. And I think she's hired a couple of new coaches. One of them is Brad Gilbert, who was Andre Agassi's coach, also coached Andy Roddick when they won majors and reached number 1 in the world. And he's a guy who has been doing a lot of ESPN commentary, hasn't coached as much directly in recent years, but he really knows how to do it. And they've had a great impact on her game. She won the Washington, D.C. title. and just won the biggest title of her career in Cincinnati and beat Iga Swiatek, we talked about before, number one player in the world. She'd been 0-7 against her, 0-14 in sets, and beat her in a tough three-setter, and seems to be showing some wonderful progress on the court. So that said, is she ready to win the US Open? She's still an outsider, but I think she's less of an outsider. Definitely want to watch some Coco, and I definitely want to watch Jessie Pegula, who has yet to play her best tennis at the majors when she needs it most, has been stopped at the quarterfinal mark many times now. I think she's at 5 or 6 quarterfinals, hasn't gotten past that. But she's had too much success on the regular tour not to have more success in the majors at some point. Is she going to win one? I don't know, but she can certainly go deep. And she, too, has been able to beat Swiatek recently. So I think it's at the very top of the game right now. There is some room for Pegula and Swiatek for Pegula and for Goff to make a move at the U.S. Open.
Yeah, before we let you go, Chris, I did have a behind the scenes question that I don't know if you know the answer to, but one of the things that I've been reading about and seeing is the issues with the loyalties of coaches in tennis. How do you coach multiple tennis players, and then whose box do you sit in? And it kind of came front and center last year with the fact that Rafa Nadal's uncle, which runs his tennis center, was coaching one of the players who then was facing Rafa.
Yeah, Felix Auger-Aliassime, yeah.
Yeah, how do they do it, and how do they deal with that, and how do the players feel about that, or do they just not care? And this is just something that I'm thinking about.
Oh no, they care. It goes way back. I mean, I remember Jim Courier when he won the French Open for the first time in 1991. He was playing Andre Agassi, and they were both disciples and campers at Nick Bollettieri's tennis academy, and Bollettieri was their coach. And Nick sat with Andre Agassi in the box for the final, and Jim was very hurt by that. Jim won the match, so ultimately got the last laugh, and they ironed things out over time, but very painful for him. And you see it all the time. The Tony Nadal story, that's a whole different level. Tony's no longer coaching Rafa directly at this stage of their careers. He's no longer Carlos Moya is doing that, but still he's a Nadal and forever will be. And he didn't even sit in the box of Felix Auger-Aliassime for that reason, knowing the sensitivities. So yeah, that for sure is real. You're seeing players sometimes, share a coach to save money. So in that situation, obviously there'll be some clarity about what's going to happen. If you ever play, I'll either not show up in the court or I'll, alternate or whatever it's going to be. Obviously the players are not unaware of what the implications are. But yeah, I think it's hard in a mental game like tennis where inside edge and inside knowledge are big. It's a hard thing to juggle.
Chris Clarey, we can't wait to watch the tennis on the court for the next couple of weeks, and then I can't wait to have you back in a couple months or whenever the book comes out and everything's ready to talk more about what you're writing about Rafa Nadal. Thanks so much, as always, for giving us the time, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Thanks, gentlemen. You guys do it right. It's always great to talk to you. It's great to be able to go in depth, and thank you all. Go back to the sweet pain of writing the book.
Wait, before you go, Chris, where can we read you before the book, though?
Well, I'm writing this Substack. So it's Tennis and Beyond, and it's been fun. Yeah, I've written a bunch of stuff, and I'm talking about some of the issues we talked about today, and I'm trying to write at least once a week for that, and I'll be writing a bit more often for it during the US Open. But if I'm writing too much for it, you guys call me up and let me know to tell me I should stop because I need to be writing the book.
Wow.
There'll never be enough.
Check out Tennis and Beyond on Substack, and we'll look for the book to come out, and look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks, guys.